She married a broken cowboy. He owned the railroad company that would reach their town in 6 months. The deed was folded 4 times, and I kept it in my left boot against the arch, because that was the last place a man in a hurry searches, and because the stiffness of the paper reminded me every step of what I was carrying. It was not the deed to the ranch. I had a dozen of those, locked in a strongbox in Denver that I had not opened in 8 months. This one was the deed to the parcel of land on the eastern edge of Harlan County, where the survey crew had hammered the last grade stake in September, and where, come spring thaw, the first tie-laying crew would begin. 1,100 men, 47 locomotives already ordered. 160 miles of track from the junction at Pueblo North and West until it reached the valley below Cutter's Ridge, which everyone in this county called the end of the world, and I called the future terminus of the Intermountain and Continental Railway, of which I was sole owner, president, and as of last Tuesday when Hendricks resigned, acting general counsel. None of that is why I'm telling this. I'm telling it because of a woman named Ruth Hayward, who was a widow when I met her, who had flour on her left sleeve, and was haggling the price of buckram at Alderman's Dry Goods when she turned and looked at me the way a person looks at something they're deciding whether to bother with. I was wearing a coat with a torn pocket. My boots were the kind that had seen weather. I had not shaved in 4 days because I had been riding fence line on the north pasture, which I did myself instead of sending the hand, because the north pasture was where the grade would cut, and I needed to see the actual ground, the real slope and rock shelf, not a survey map. She looked at me like I was a man who repaired fence. I did not correct her. You have to understand something about the 8 months before that. I want to lay it out plainly because it matters to what happened, and because most men who know this story only know the end of it and they get the order wrong. My wife Clara died in March, not from anything dramatic, a fever that came on hard and turned and took her in 11 days. We had been married 19 years. The ranch, the one I actually lived on, the 240 acres south of Cutter Creek, where I kept a small herd, and kept my own hands busy because idle hands on a rich man make him soft. That ranch was hers before it was mine. I mean that plain. She had homesteaded it with her first husband, Thomas Hayward's cousin as it happens, who died of a horse rolling on him in the winter of '62, and she had held on to it through the drought years and the hard winters by herself until I came through looking to buy grazing rights, and she told me to go to hell, and I told her I'd come back in a month, and she said don't bother, and I came back in a month. We were married that November. The ranch never became mine in any way that mattered. It was always her land, her soil, the kitchen she had built with her own decisions, the garden she had planted where she wanted it. I brought money. She brought the thing money can't buy, which is a place that's actually a home instead of a structure a man sleeps inside. I understood that clearly after she was gone because suddenly the house was just a structure again. I walked through it in the mornings, and it was right and exact and entirely empty of everything that mattered. I did not sell it. I could not have explained why, and men do not generally explain their reasons to themselves out loud, but I kept it. Kept the hands-on, kept the herd, kept the kitchen in the same arrangement she'd left it. Augustina, who had cooked for Clara the last 6 years, offered to stay on, and I said yes, and felt no gratitude the way you feel no gratitude for a plank across a river when you're crossing it. I rode fence that summer, more than I needed to. The north pasture, the west line, the rocky section up near the ridge where the wire kept pulling loose from frost-heaved posts. I fixed things with my own hands. The hands Petey and Cole and the boy they called Duster, who was not a boy at all but was 43 and had simply been called that since before anyone could remember. They did not say anything about the boss doing wire work because they knew. Men who work land always know when another man needs to work land with his hands instead of his head. August was when Hendricks wired me about the Harlan County survey results. I read the wire twice, sat on a rock near the fence I had just repaired, and felt the particular flat feeling of a very large thing arriving at the wrong time. The survey was good, better than good. The grade through the valley was workable, the bedrock where we needed it, the drainage manageable. 18 months from groundbreaking, we could have a working terminus. Everything I had been building toward for 11 years, every dollar put into the Intermountain and Continental, every fight with the Denver investors, every surveying crew I had grub-staked, every favor traded with the Federal Land Office. It was all arriving now, exactly as planned, and I did not particularly care. I cared in the part of me that was the owner of the railroad. That part recognized good news. The rest of me was sitting on a rock in a pasture where the grass was going yellow at the end of summer and thinking about nothing much. I went to Harlan County in September to walk the grade myself. I told Petey I'd be back in 3 weeks. It took 6, because once I was there I found I did not especially want to go back. The ranch without Clara was a structure. A strange town where nobody knew me was a different kind of emptiness, which is at least novel. I stayed at Birch's boarding house, which was the better of the two in Cutter's Ridge. I rode out to the survey stakes every few days. I went to the land office and did the parcel work myself, which confused the land agent, Fogarty, considerably, because I had arrived looking like a rancher and was suddenly producing documents with the letterhead of a Denver law firm. Fogarty was a careful man. He asked me if I was who those documents said I was, and I told him I was, and he looked at me for a long time and then stamped the papers. The town did not know. I had no reason to tell them, and some particular reason not to. When a railroad comes to a town, land prices move. Men who bought 5 years ago and held become wealthy. Men who sell 6 months before the announcement walk away from the largest windfall of their lives. I had done that to enough towns, watched it happen, watched the men who cashed out early and the men who held and the different expressions on their faces 18 months later, that I had some feeling about it. Not guilt exactly. You don't feel guilty for what a railroad does to a town, because the railroad makes the town. But I did not want to be the man who sat in Birch's boarding house and watched his neighbors make financial decisions while he knew the one thing they didn't. So I did not tell them. I kept to myself. Fixed the fence on the parcel I'd bought east of town because it needed fixing and because it was my parcel and because I had a habit now of fixing things with my hands. Nodded at men on the street. Had my supper at Birch's most nights. It was a nothing life for a man with 1,100 employees and 47 locomotives on order, and it suited me well enough. Then it was October and I needed buckram. I do not now remember what the buckram was for. Some repair to a saddle bag, I believe. A thing that needed doing. I went to Alderman's and Ruth Hayward was there with flour on her sleeve and a firm opinion about the price of buckram. I noticed her jaw first. That sounds wrong. I mean the set of it, the way she was holding her position on the price with a patience that was not soft at all, but was in fact a kind of settled stubbornness, the way a fence post is settled in the ground. Alderman was giving her the price, and she was not arguing it exactly, just not moving. And Alderman, who was not a weak man, was starting to reconsider. She was not young. Mid-30s, I would have said then, which turned out to be close 37, as I learned later. Dark hair going to gray at the right temple in a way that had its own logic, like the gray had decided on that particular spot and would not be persuaded to go elsewhere. She was not dressed well, but she was dressed carefully, which is a different thing and a harder thing. The coat was old, but it was brushed. The boots had been resoled at least twice. She settled the buckram price to her satisfaction, collected her parcel, and turned. I was standing near the bolt ends, waiting. She looked at me the way I said, like something she was deciding about, and then said, "You're the one staying at Birch's." I said I was. She said, "The fence on the east parcel, you've been working it." I said that was my parcel now, I'd bought it in September. She said, "I know, Fogarty told half the town." She was not unkind about it, just informational. Then she said, "The post at the northeast corner was rotted through. If you only patch the wire without pulling the post, you'll be doing it again in spring." I told her I pulled the post. She looked at me a moment longer like she was revising something. Then she nodded and went out. That was the whole of it the first time. I learned her story in pieces. Harlan County is a small place and people talk, not maliciously but thoroughly. She was Ruth Hayward, née Coulter, born in Indiana, come west with her husband, James Hayward, in 1871. James had been a decent man by all accounts, a dry goods buyer originally, who had come west with the idea of raising horses and had discovered he was not built for it. He had died in '74 of a lung complaint, leaving Ruth with the small house on the edge of town, the horse operation which had failed, a substantial debt to the Grange Bank, and 2 children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4. That had been 5 years. In 5 years she had paid off the Grange debt, raised the children, taken in sewing and alterations, and somehow acquired a small flock of sheep whose wool she sold and whose meat she traded, and a kitchen garden that people said was the most productive in the county. She did not take charity. People had offered, and she had declined in a way that apparently made it clear the offer would not be welcome again. The son, Will, was 11 now, and already working for wages at the livery on Saturdays. The daughter, Macy, was 9, and was apparently a particular child. I learned this from Augustina's cousin, who lived in Cutter's Ridge and was the source of most of what I learned in those early weeks, not difficult but very specific in her ideas about things, the way some children are. I do not know when I started paying attention to all this. It happened gradually, the way attention moves toward something warm. I saw her at the general store again, and at the church, and once at the edge of the ridge where a line of people went on Sundays to look at the view, which was indeed considerable. The valley spread out below, the creek a silver line in it, and to the east the flat land going all the way to the edge of sight. I stood some distance from her that Sunday and watched her show Macy where the creek bent around the old cottonwood stand, her hand on the girl's shoulder pointing. Will was throwing rocks at something. She called him back without sharpness. He came. I watched her and thought about things I had not thought about in some time. November came in cold. I had not gone back to my ranch, which I had told myself I would do in October, and now I was telling myself I would do it in November and knowing I probably wouldn't. Petey wired me twice practical questions, and I answered them with the decisions he needed and nothing more. The ranch was running without me. It had been designed to run without me because I was often in Denver, and the design had worked too well. I ate supper at Birch's table most evenings. There were 4 other boarders, a land agent from Pueblo who was looking to buy, a young man named Carver who was waiting for his brother to arrive and never explained more than that, an older man named Sievert who coughed at night and appeared to be dying of something and who I never asked about, and sometimes there were passing travelers who stayed a night and were gone. Birch herself was a large, quiet woman who cooked adequately and kept a clean house and had no apparent interest in her boarders beyond their weekly rent. Ruth Hayward came to supper at Birch's on a Thursday in mid-November. I did not know she did this. It appeared she came once a month or so when Birch invited her, the two of them being friends of the particular kind women make when they have both been left alone to manage things and have managed them. She brought Macy. Will was old enough to stay home for an evening. She sat across from me without any ceremony about it. Macy sat beside her and looked at me steadily across the table with the kind of frank assessment that children can make because they have not yet learned that it's impolite. "You're the fence man," Macy said. Ruth said, "Macy." Macy did not look away. "That's what Mama calls you." Ruth's expression did not change in any dramatic way. Just the slight adjustment of a person deciding not to be embarrassed by a thing because being embarrassed would be worse than not. She looked at me and said, "She's not wrong. I didn't know your name for a while." I told her my name, Emmett Crane. She said Ruth Hayward, which I knew, and did not say anything about why I already knew it, because in a small town that would have been strange. We ate. Birch's supper was a roast, and it was better than her usual. The land agent from Pueblo talked about land prices, which I listened to with careful blankness. Macy asked me why my coat had a torn pocket. I told her I'd caught it on a fence nail. She said her mother could fix it if I brought it by. Ruth said, "Macy," again more quietly. After supper, when the others had gone to their rooms or out to the porch, I stayed to help Birch clear the table, which was not a thing male boarders generally did. But I had been brought up a certain way by a woman who would not have understood a man sitting still while dishes needed moving. Ruth was still there, helping Birch. We cleared the table together, the 3 of us, without making anything of it, and it was the most ordinary I had felt since March. At the door, getting her coat, Ruth looked at me and said, "You're not from here." I said no. She said, "You're staying, though." I said I wasn't sure yet. She considered that, then she said, "Well, bring the coat if you want it fixed." She and Macy went out into the cold. I stood at Birch's front window and watched them go down the street, Macy holding her mother's hand, the lamplight from the houses cutting yellow rectangles into the dark. I brought the coat. I know how that sounds. A grown man with, I will just say it plainly, with more money than most men see in a lifetime, bringing a coat to a widow's house to have a pocket mended because her 9-year-old daughter offered. But I want to say something about that because I think it matters. When you have a great deal of money and you spend a long time not telling people, you learn something about what people actually are toward you, as opposed to what they would be if they knew. Clara had known from the beginning. She had done her own asking before she married me, and I had been honest. And it had not changed her because she had not wanted anything from me that money could give her. She had already built her own life, and what she wanted was a partner in it. But most people, most of my life, once they knew, they were never again entirely natural. Something shifted in the room. I became a category instead of a man. Ruth didn't know. In Ruth's house, when I knocked on the door that Saturday morning and she answered it and I held out the coat, I was the fence man from Birch's who had a torn pocket. That was all I was, and it was enough. More than enough. I had not been that in a long time. She looked at the coat, she looked at me. She said, "Come in then, it's cold." The house was small, and it was exactly right. Not tidy in the way that means no one lives in it, but ordered in the way that means someone has decided where each thing belongs and enforced that decision across years. A braided rug that was going thin in the center. A cast iron stove that was burning well. On the table, Macy's schoolwork spread out with a precision that suggested the precision was Macy's own preference. Will was not visible. I gathered he was out. Macy looked up from her work and said, "You brought it." I said I brought it. She nodded as though this confirmed something. She went back to her schoolwork. Ruth put a needle through the coat with the ease of someone who has done 10,000 such repairs and will do 10,000 more. I sat at the table because she gestured at the chair, not formally but practically, the way you gesture at a chair when you need both hands for something else. We did not talk at first. The stove crackled. Outside, wind was coming up. Then she said, without looking up from the coat, "What do you do, Emmett Crane?" I told her I had a ranch, south of Cutter Creek, which was 60 miles south, and she would not know it, and some other investments. She said, "What kind of investments?" I said land mostly, transportation. She bit the thread clean, looked at the pocket, said, "That's vague." I said it was. She looked up then, not suspicious. Just straight the way she'd looked at Alderman over the buckram price, deciding about something. She said, "Are you in trouble?" I said, "What kind of trouble?" She said, "Legal, the kind where you'd want to be somewhere people don't know your name." I almost laughed. It came up in me quickly, that laugh, and I let some of it out, and it felt like something moving that had been still too long. I told her no, I was not in any legal trouble that I knew of. I told her I had come to look at some land and stayed because I had not been in a hurry to be anywhere else. She held the coat out to me. I took it. She said, "Your wife died." I said yes. She said, "This spring I heard." I said yes. She looked at me for a moment, not with pity. I would have felt that, and I would have stood up and thanked her for the coat and not come back. It was not pity. It was the recognition of someone who has been in a similar country. She said, "It gets to be a different weight after a while, not lighter, just different." I said, "Yes, that's right." She stood up and smoothed her apron, and that was all there was of that. She called into the back room for Macy to put her work away. It was lunchtime, and then looked at me in a way that was an invitation without being a performance of one. She said, "You might as well eat if you don't have somewhere." I did not have somewhere. I had lunch in Ruth Hayward's kitchen 4 times in November and twice in December, and it acquired a naturalness that surprised me because I had not thought I had naturalness left in me for new things. Will warmed to me slowly, in the way of boys who have been the man of a household since 11 and do not give up the title easily, which I understood and respected. I did not try to be his friend. I helped him with a problem he was having with the left rear wheel of a cart he was repairing, because he mentioned it without asking for help, and I had an idea about the hub, and we worked on it together one afternoon without making it into anything, and after that he stopped looking at me like a fence post he was deciding whether to pull. Macy was something else. Macy had decided I was all right from the first table at Birch's, and her attention was of the uncomplicated kind that children have before they learn to guard it. She showed me her schoolwork. She explained the sheep to me with a thoroughness that implied she believed I knew nothing about sheep, which was fair. She asked me questions without preamble. How old was I? Had I always had gray in my beard? Did I know how to braid? Would I teach her to whittle? I answered what I could, and told her honestly what I couldn't do, and she received this information with equanimity. Ruth watched all of this from the corner of her eye. She watched me with her children the way you watch a dog that has presented itself as friendly and that you have tentatively decided to believe but have not entirely decided yet. I understood this also. She had 2 children and a life she had built herself, and she was careful about what she let into it. I told myself I was not courting her. I was sharing lunches with a neighbor. The distinction was becoming difficult to maintain by mid-December. The thing happened in December. I want to tell it straight. I had ridden out to the east parcel to check the fence, which I did more than was necessary and knew it. The air was iron cold and the ground ringing underfoot. I was working a loose section near the northeast corner. Ruth had been right about the post there. It had been worse than I thought. I had replaced it in October, but the surrounding ground had shifted and the wire had gone slack again when I heard the horse. It was a good horse, well kept, and the man on it was Edward Sable. I knew Sable's name before I knew his face, which is the way of things when you own a railroad. He was a land speculator out of Colorado Springs, and he had a reputation for being exactly what land speculators generally are. He had been sniffing around Harlan County for 6 weeks, which I knew from Fogarty, and now here he was on my parcel, which told me he was less interested in the county generally than in this piece of land specifically, which told me he had a better surveyor than I had thought. He pulled up and looked at me, a man in a worn coat mending fence. He said, "Was this the Crane parcel?" I said it was. He said he'd heard I might be looking to sell. He had not heard this because it was not true, but it was the kind of thing you say to open. I kept working the wire. I said I wasn't looking to sell. He said he'd make it worth my while. He gave me a number that was fair for what he thought the land was worth, about a third of what it would be worth in 18 months. I said it wasn't for sale. He looked at the parcel, at me. He had the look of a man doing arithmetic. He said, "You know something." I kept working. He said, "You're not a fence man, you're something else." I said I was a rancher from south of Cutter Creek. He said, "Sure." He did not say it like he believed it. He said it like he was filing the disagreement for later. He rode off without threatening me directly, which was the sign of a man who was patient and experienced. The ones who threaten you right away are not the problem. The ones who ride off calculating are the problem. I finished the fence. I rode back to town. I went to Birch's and I sat in my room for a while and I thought about things. Sable was going to keep looking. He was going to find what he was looking for, because a man like that always finds it eventually. And what he was going to find was that the land on the eastern edge of Harlan County was about to become the terminus of the Intermountain and Continental Railway. And when he found it, whether by a better survey, or by a contact in Denver, or by the sheer attritional patience of a man with money and time, he was going to move on it. He would buy what he could. He would also move on whatever else he could leverage. I thought about Ruth's house on the edge of town. I thought about the deed to that house, which I did not know the details of but could guess. James Hayward had bought it in '71. There was almost certainly a mortgage. She had paid off the Grange debt, but that might not be the only one. I thought about what Sable would do once he understood what land in this town was about to be worth. I thought about widows who have built something from nothing and what happens to them when men with money and no particular conscience arrive. I am not saying what I decided then was purely noble. I am trying to tell it honestly. I went to Ruth's house that evening. She answered the door and looked at me and said, "It's late." I said I knew. I said I needed to talk to her. She looked at me for a moment, then she opened the door wider. She put the children to bed first. I sat at the kitchen table and waited. When she came back, she poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from me and waited without fidgeting, which I had come to understand was one of her particular qualities. I told her there was a man in town named Sable who was buying land. She said she knew. Fogarty had mentioned him. I said she should not sell to him at any price, and that if he approached her, she should send for me first. She looked at me. She said, "Why?" I said because he would offer her less than it was worth. She said, "How would you know what it's worth?" I said I had a sense of where the country was going. She kept looking at me. She said, "Emmett, what are you?" I said I was a rancher. She said, "You've said that." I don't think that's the whole of it. I looked at my coffee. I looked at her. She had her hands around her cup and her eyes steady on me, and there was no accusation in her face, just waiting, the set of patience. I said, "The railroad is coming through here. Through the valley. I know when and I know the route. I'm part of the reason it's coming." She was quiet. Outside, the wind had come up again. The stove was banked for the night and the kitchen had gone cool. She said, "How much apart?" I said, "I own it." Another quiet, longer. She said, "The railroad." I said, "Yes." She said, the Intermountain and Continental. I said I was surprised she knew the name. She said her husband had followed railroads. He had thought there might be one through this valley. He had bought this lot partly for that reason in '71, before the surveys had been done. And then he had died, and she had not thought of it for years. And then last winter someone in town had mentioned a survey crew, and she had started thinking about it again. I said, so you knew. She said, I suspected. She said, I didn't know you were the one who'd bring it. She looked at me a long time. She said, why didn't you say so? I told her. I told her about Denver and the investors and the way a room changes when people know. I told her about sitting in her kitchen being the fence man from Birch's and finding that easier to breathe in than I had expected. I did not tell her about Clara, not directly, but I think she understood what I was circling. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, so all of this. She gestured at the table between us, not specifically, just at the general thing. You were deciding whether to trust me. I said yes. She said, and now you are. I said yes. She looked down at her coffee. She picked a small thread from her sleeve, not the flower this time, just a thread from whatever she'd been sewing that afternoon. She set it on the edge of the table. She said, I'm not going to pretend that doesn't change things. The railroad changes things for this town, and that changes things for me. I won't pretend otherwise. I said I understood. She said, but I want you to know that I was already. She stopped. She started again. She said, the railroad doesn't change what I think of you. Which is that you're a careful man and a decent one, and that you fixed that fence post correctly the first time, and that my children have not taken to a stranger the way they've taken to you since James died. I did not say anything. There was nothing right to say. She said, I want you to know that. What happened next happened in the particular way that things happen when two careful people have decided, which is not like lightning at all, but like ice thawing. A long, slow giving way of what has been held rigid, not dramatic, just inevitable once the temperature has changed. She invited me for Christmas dinner. I came. We walked in the afternoon, the four of us, up to the ridge to see the view, and Macy held my hand on the icy part of the trail without asking, just took it, and I held on. Will walked beside his mother, and they talked quietly about something I did not hear, and I did not need to hear it. I told Petey I would not be back for the winter. He wired me back one line, figured. Petey was a man of few words, and I was grateful for it. In January, I spoke to Ruth plainly. I told her what I had, what I owned, what I was responsible for. I wanted her to know the full of it before. I did not say before what. She knew before what. She listened. She asked specific questions, not impressed ones. She asked about the debt structure of the railroad because her husband had followed railroads, and she knew that railroads were often built on debt. I told her the structure honestly. She nodded. She asked about the timeline for the terminus, and I told her spring groundbreaking and running trains by fall of '81 if everything went as planned, and nothing ever went entirely as planned. She asked what the land around the terminus would be worth, and I told her, and I watched her face do arithmetic. She said, I own this lot. I said yes. She said, free and clear. I paid off the last of the mortgage in '76. I said I didn't know that. She said, I know you didn't. She said it without heat, just placing the fact. Then she said, so I don't need you to rescue me from Sable. I said no. She said, I wanted to be clear about that. I said I understood. She looked at her hands. She said, I have asked myself whether I'd be having this conversation if you were just the fence man. I said, what did you decide? She said, yes, but I wanted to be honest that I've asked. I said I had asked myself the same thing about her. Whether I'd still be sitting in this kitchen if she didn't have a free and clear lot 200 yards from the future terminus of my railroad. She looked at me sharply. I said I would. I know I would because I was already before I knew about the lot. I said, but I wanted you to know I'd asked. A quiet came in then, a different kind than before. Not the quiet of waiting, but the quiet of two people who have said the difficult thing, and are sitting with the air of it. Then she said, all right. She said it the way she settled the buckram price, with the set of a woman who has decided. We were married in March. I want to talk about that, about the specific of it, because the specific is where the thing lived. The ceremony was at the church in Cutter's Ridge, small, the people who mattered. Birch was there. Fogarty was there and looked pleased with himself, as if he had arranged it, which he had not. A few women from the town who had known Ruth through the hard years. Petey rode 60 miles to be there and shook my hand once hard, and that was his whole speech. Will stood with a seriousness that an 11-year-old should not be able to carry, but which he carried. Macy wore a dress that Ruth had made from new cloth, not remade from an old one, which was the sign of an occasion. After walking back from the church, Macy took my left hand and Will, after a moment, took my right, and Ruth walked on Macy's other side, and that is the picture I carry of that day. Not the ceremony, that. That night after the children were in bed, we sat by the stove. The house was the same house, the braided rug still going thin in the center, the cast iron stove burning well. She was my wife. I was in the house that had been hers and was now ours in whatever way two people who have already built their own lives can make a thing theirs together. She said, "You know the town is going to figure it out." I said, "Yes." She said, "When they do, they're going to have opinions about me." I said some of them would. She said that I married you for the railroad. I said some of them will say that. She said, "Does that bother you?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "It would have once. Right now I don't particularly care what men who don't know you think about why you married me." She looked at me. I said, "I know why you married me." She said, "Do you?" I said, "You married me because the north fence post was rotted through, and I pulled it instead of patching around it." She laughed. I had not heard her laugh openly like that before. It was good. It was a new sound in the house, and it was good. She put her hand on mine where it rested on the table. Just her hand on mine. She said, "That's not wrong." Spring came the way it comes in that country, not gently, but with a kind of brutal decisiveness, the cold giving way all at once in the space of a week, and the mud arriving, and the smell of the thaw and the cottonwoods putting out the first tentative leaves along the creek. I wired Hendricks. The tie-laying crew was on schedule. The graders would break ground on the eastern parcel in May. I told Ruth the date. She said, "Should we tell the town?" I said the Denver papers would carry it in 2 weeks. The town would know by the end of the month regardless. She said, "So they'll know." I said, "Yes." She said, "And then they'll know about you." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good." She said it simply. "It's been a long time for you to carry it alone." I had not thought about it that way. I had thought about the practical reasons for the secrecy, the land prices, the Sable question, the way rooms change. I had not thought about the weight of it. But she was right. 8 months of being a fence man, of being small and quiet and nobody, and the relief of that had been real, but so had the loneliness of it. The particular loneliness of a man who cannot say what he is because he has found it useful not to be known. She saw that. She put it into words without ceremony, the way she said true things. I said, "I'm not sure how I feel about going back to being who I was." She said, "You don't have to be who you were. You just have to be who you are." I looked at her. She said, "Those are different things. You know that." I did know it. I had known it since March, since the thaw, since the ceremony and the 4 of us walking back from the church in the cold. Who I was not who I had been before. Who I was included this kitchen and these children and this woman who had looked at me like I was a man who mended fence and had not required me to be anything else until I was ready to say it. The Denver papers ran it on April the 14th. Emmett Crane, president of the Intermountain and Continental Railway, announces terminus at Cutter's Ridge. There was a paragraph about the survey, a paragraph about the investment, and a sentence at the end noting that Mr. Crane had recently taken a wife in Harlan County and would be maintaining a residence there in addition to his Denver offices. Fogarty came to the house the next morning. He was not angry. He was a careful man and he understood the reasons. But he looked at me for a long time and then he said, "You lived here 6 months." I said I did. He said, "Eating at Birch's table." I said yes. He said, "And fixing fence." I said yes. He looked at Ruth. He said, "You knew." Ruth said, "Since January." Fogarty said, "And you married him anyway." She said, "I married him because he pulled the post." Fogarty looked from one of us to the other. Then he went out shaking his head in a way that was not disapproval, but was something closer to bewilderment. Sable came to see me that same week. He came to the house not to find me on a parcel, but to the front door, which was a statement about how he understood the situation to have changed. I answered the door. He looked at me for a moment. He said, "I should have known in October." I said, "You almost did." He said, "The coat." I said the coat was a real coat. He almost smiled. He was not a man I liked, but he was not a stupid one. He said, "Is there any part of the Eastern approach you'd consider selling to a private investor?" I said no. He said, "The town lots along the main street." I said I didn't own those. The townspeople own them, and he could deal with them directly. He said, "They'll want too much now." I said, "Yes, they will." He looked at me. He said, "You did that deliberately, letting the town keep their land until they knew." I said I had not bought what wasn't mine to buy. He thought about that. He said, "That's an odd philosophy for a railroad man." I said maybe. He went. He did not come back. What happened to the town is what always happens when a railroad arrives, which is that it grows, and the growing is not entirely comfortable and not entirely welcome, and is also not to be stopped. The main street extended east toward the future station. The price of lots tripled in 18 months. Men who had bought land in the valley 10 years ago and held it found themselves comfortable for the first time. Men who had sold early did not think about it if they could help it. Fogarty sold the lot he'd held east of the church and paid off his house and sent his daughter to school in Denver. He came to tell me this with a particular expression, the expression of a man who is grateful but is finding gratitude complicated. Birch sold the boarding house and retired. She told me this without sentimentality, which was consistent. Ruth's lot, the lot James Hayward had bought in 1871 with the railroad in mind, that Ruth had paid off in 1876 and held through the hard years and the uncertain ones. That lot was on the main street, 200 yards from where the station was going up, and its value was considerable. Ruth did not sell it. She had plans, she said. She was vague about them for a while, and then one morning in August she showed me a drawing she had made, careful and precise, of a dry goods store. A real one, she said. Not Alderman's with its sticking drawers and its unlabeled bins. A real one with a storeroom and a back counter and a proper inventory system. I looked at the drawing for a long time. I looked at her. She said, "I have capital now." I said, "You always had capital." She said, "No, I always had the land, now I have the capital." I said, "I have money, Ruth." She said, "I know you do. This is mine." I understood that. I understood it in the way I had understood her kitchen. It had always been hers, and now it was ours, and some part of it would always be hers. In the good way, the way that means a person has built something with their own hands and will not have it given to them from elsewhere. I did not say more about it. The store opened in October of 1881, 2 months after the first train ran into Cutter's Ridge Station on a morning that drew the entire town to the platform. Ruth stood beside me on the platform, and Will stood beside her, and Macy was on my shoulders, which was not dignified, but she wanted to be able to see, and I had no objection. The locomotive came around the eastern bend trailing steam, and the crowd made a noise, and Macy made a noise directly into my ear. The store was called Hayward's. She did not change the name when we married, and I did not expect her to. What do I want to say about all of it? I am an old man telling this, and I want to say it right. I was broken before that October in Cutter's Ridge. Not in any visible way. The railroad was fine. The ranch was fine. From the outside, I was a wealthy man who had lost his wife and was managing it with the plainness that men are supposed to manage these things with. But inside, I was something like that rotted post, solid-looking on the surface, the kind you don't know is gone until you lean on it. I had been pulling away from the center of my own life for 8 months without knowing it, doing the work of it without living in it. Ruth did not rescue me in any dramatic sense. She did not know I needed rescuing in the beginning. She treated me like a fence man and gave me lunch and let her children make up their own minds about me. And in doing that, she gave me back something I had lost, which was the simple fact of being in a kitchen with people who needed nothing from me that I couldn't give with my hands or my steadiness or my presence. She found out what I was, and she married me anyway, and then she told me, plain, that who I was not the same as who I had been, and that this was not a loss. I want to say something about a specific afternoon, late October of '81, a Sunday. The store had been open 3 weeks. Will was 15 by then and had started working in it on Saturdays, proving more natural with inventory than Ruth had expected, which pleased her in the complicated way it pleases a parent when a child is better at something than you planned for. Macy was 12, all opinions and ambitions. We went up to the ridge that Sunday, the four of us. The train had been running 6 weeks, and from the ridge you could see the station now, the new building raw lumber still, and the platform and the water tower. And further east, on clear days, you could see the curve of the grade disappearing into the flats, 1,100 men having bent the land to it over 18 months of work. I had bent the land. That was mine. Ruth stood beside me and looked out at it. She put her hand through my arm, not dramatically, just her hand through my arm. She said, "You built that?" I said, "We did. The workers, Hendricks, the Denver investors, years of it." She said, "I mean you, Emmett Crane. You decided it would go through this valley, and it went through this valley." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm glad it was you." I looked at her. She said, "Not because of what it's worth. I mean, I'm glad the man who decided to do this was the kind of man who fixes his own fences." She said, "The town is a different thing now. That happens with railroads. But the way it happened here, the fact that you were here before it came, living ordinary, not buying up what wasn't yours, that made a difference to how it landed." I did not say anything for a while. The wind was moving the dry grass on the ridge. I said, "You saw all that?" She said, "I see you. That's the same thing. That's the one I keep." Of everything, the years that came after, the railroad expanded, a second line. The ranch sold eventually to a neighbor who loved it the way it deserved. The house in Cutter's Ridge expanded once and then again when Macy's children needed room. Will's store grown into something Clara would have recognized. Of all of it, that's the afternoon I keep. Her hand through my arm, the ridge above the valley. The track curving east into the flat land, the train that came at 3 o'clock every afternoon now regular as weather, the smoke of it visible from up here before you could hear it. She saw me, not the railroad, not the money, me. The man who pulled the post, instead of patching around it. It turned out that was enough. It turned out that was more than I had thought I'd have again. The 3 o'clock train came around the bend, and Macy said she could see the steam. And I watched my wife watch the valley she had held onto through the hard years. And I put my hand over hers where it rested on my arm, and that is where this ends.